Hello everyone. I am Mihir. I work with the Indian Institute for Human Settlements in Bangalore, and welcome to this second webinar in the series, which deals with topics from urban ecology. So, this series is sort of part of a exhibit in collaboration with Bangalore Sustainability Forum and IHS Library, which has been running in IHS campus at in Bangalore for the past 2 months. This exhibition theme was mainly to introduce a wider audience to what all studies and how research is being conducted in ecology, especially in cities and where you have a very high human population, and how different sort of aspects of these ecological interactions can be studied. So, this is the second webinar in the series of 4 talks. So today's speaker is Purabi Deshpande. So she is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Turku in Finland, and she studies urban ecology and interaction of species. So she studies. So some of her work has sort of explored how native species of animals can interact with non-native species of plants in a city, and what sort of how these interactions pan out in cities and so on. So Purbi will be sort of conducting her, I mean, giving her talk today on this topic. And her title of her topic is Apples and Oranges, a bird's perspective on native and introduced plant species in the city. So over to you, Purbi. Uh,
Hi, thank you so much. I will just share my screen and start the presentation. And can you confirm that you can still see everything and hear me properly?
yes.
All right, now I just want to move the Zoom controls out of the way. All right, yes. So hello also to all the participants who I can't see right now. But yeah, thank you so much for having me and giving me this opportunity to talk about some of the research that I've done for my PhD. And as Mihir was saying, I am interested in studying the interactions that occur in ecosystems. So either animals interacting with each other, or in this case, how animals are interacting with plants. And yes, I am a city girl. I have always lived in cities. I intend to continue to live in cities. So it's only natural for me that the academic interests that I have are also explored in the spaces that I live in. And because of this, I've had the opportunity now to live in a few cities around the world and also to study them. And while every urban area is unique in its own self because of its geographical location or the cultural aspects, there are still some common themes that all urban areas are experiencing, and some of them are global. So all of us know that anthropogenic climate change is increasing the temperatures of the planet. And in urban areas, because of urban heat island effects, this is often accentuated, and then there are more extreme temperatures experienced in urban areas as compared to the surrounding natural areas. At the same time, we are also having a crisis of biodiversity where we're losing more and more species every year across the planet. And in urban areas, we see this in terms of biotic homogenization. So only a few species that are able to handle the urban pressures are thriving in big numbers, but the number of species in urban areas is reducing. And of course, these themes are studied quite widely in pristine natural ecosystems, but they're not explored that much in urban ecosystems, and that's why I'm interested in them. And they're sort of at the background of my research. But the really interesting peculiarity that's common across urban areas all over the world is that humans like traveling to different places, collecting things that they find in these new places and bringing them back home. So this is also true for species of animals and plants, and this has been happening for many a millennia. As you can see from this quote from an Assyrian king, he talks about how he's like traveled to new lands and got species that none of his forefathers knew about, and he's planted them in his own orchards. So we've been doing this. We introduce species into our own home for aesthetic purposes, for food, for medicinal purposes, and so on. And in a novel ecosystem, like an urban ecosystem, when we're introducing more new species, it's really interesting to understand how the introduction of these species then affects the interactions that they're having with species that were already in the ecosystem. Because of course, everything in an ecosystem is connected and interdependent on each other. So introducing something new can change something small, which can have cascading effects throughout the ecosystem. And some links can be broken, new links can be formed. So it's really important to understand this to ensure that the ecosystem sustains itself in the future. But before I get into like the real questions that I was asking for my research, I'd like to introduce some terms that I'm going to be using. And these are hotly contested in the literature still, so I am only defining them for the purpose of this talk as I understand them. So when I say native species, I am referring to a species that has evolutionary history associated with the region that it is in. I might use the terms introduce alien exotic species interchangeably, but all of them, I mean a species that has been introduced into a geographical region by humans where it wasn't there before this introduction by humans. And this is not to be confused with invasive species. Invasive species are species that are introduced into a region, have proliferated to such a high rate that they are now harming the local ecosystem. So all the introduced species in my talk are not necessarily harmful invasive species. Mostly they're species that are introduced here and could be naturalized and not cause harm to the local ecosystem. We don't know yet. So that's why I was exploring these questions. So I was interested in studying two cities and the interactions within them. So first I was looking at how nectar feeding birds and mammals in Bangalore are interacting with native and introduced trees. And then in Helsinki, I was interested in understanding whether fruit-eating birds are contributing to the spread of introduced plants from the urban center of Helsinki into more natural areas. And Bangalore and Helsinki are completely different cities. So I'm not comparing them per se, but both of them are experiencing the same sort of challenges to a different degree. So Bangalore is experiencing urbanization to a much higher degree than Helsinki is, but Helsinki is facing the brunt of climate change with much more higher intensity than Bangalore is. And this is why I wanted to explore sort of the same ecological processes in two different cities that are having these challenges at different levels. So first coming to Bangalore, we all know that Bangalore is Garden City. So earlier research from Harini Nagendra and colleagues has shown that there are 108 species of trees in the city, and up to 77% of these are introduced to the region. And because of the historical planting drives that took place here, a lot of the trees in Bangalore have large floral display sizes. That is, they produce a lot of flowers together. And this makes it an excellent case study to understand how nectar feeding birds and mammals are interacting with native and introduced trees. So what I really wanted to understand was, as Bangalore is rapidly losing green cover and becoming grayer, are nectar feeding animals still preferring native species? Are they using introduced species because they are available more, and so on? So to explore this, I selected 8 species of native and introduced trees each in Bangalore. I selected trees that are commonly planted or commonly found across the city. And I observed these trees, 4 individuals of each species, twice a month for 30 minutes. And when I was observing them, I first recorded all the species of birds and mammals that I saw on the tree, but then focusing in on the interactions that the animals were having with the flowers of the tree. I classified the behavior of the animals into pollination, which is an interaction that is helpful for the plant. So if a bird or mammal approached the plant from the opening of the flower, so in the front, in a way that it could touch its anthers, then I considered this as pollination. But if it did not do that, if it punctured the flower at any other part and took nectar through there, or if they were eating the entire flower and these interactions were not helpful to the plant, they were classified as nectar theft or florivory. And then quickly moving on to the results, I will explain the graph a little bit. So on the left-hand side over here are all the tree species that I studied. And if there is a blue bar, then those species were native. If there's a red bar, then they're the introduced tree species. On the right-hand side are all the bird species that I saw on these plants. And the ones with the green bars or bolded names are the ones that were interacting with the flowers of the trees. The others were seen on the trees for other reasons like roosting, nesting, and so on. And the lines that are connecting them are instances of interactions of the bird species with the plants. And if the lines are thicker, that means that there was more interaction. But basically, what this graph is showing us is that there is a complex network of interactions going on between birds and trees in Bangalore. And as you can see, no single species of birds is only interacting with the native species or only interacting with the introduced species. So this complexity is irrespective of the origin of the tree species. When we looked at pollination more closely, so if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, so birds were seen to pollinate native trees more. So after a flower is pollinated, then it forms a fruit. The fruit has a seed. The seed is then dispersed, and that's how the plant would propagate. So the birds were helping the seed set of native trees. But when it came to introduced trees, they were stealing nectar, so not providing the service of pollination. However, on the graph on the right-hand side shows what is happening with squirrels. We didn't see a single instance of a squirrel pollinating a native tree. They were more likely to pollinate introduced tree species and eat the flowers of native trees. So what all these results show is that urban trees are a very important resource for birds and mammals in Bangalore, that birds are harming the seed set of the introduced tree species. Hence, it's less likely that the spread of these introduced tree species is helped by birds from Bangalore to more natural areas. But of course, birds are only one of the pollinators. There are insects and there are other mammal species like bats. So these taxa need to be explored more in detail to understand the invasion potential of the introduced trees in Bangalore. I've only presented a short part of the work. I'm happy to talk about it more, but if you're interested in reading it, the paper is available openly in the journal Science of the Total Environment. Now, quickly jumping to Helsinki. For those who are not familiar, Helsinki is all the way up in the north here. And as in Bangalore, there were a lot of plants that produce large floral display sizes. In Helsinki, the plants produce a lot of fleshy fruit, so berries and things like that. So this is what makes Helsinki ideal to study birds that eat fruits. But unlike Bangalore, in Helsinki, there are quite a few species that are planted still in the city that are recognized invasive species. However, Helsinki is much more greener than Bangalore. So you can almost imagine that there are green areas radiating out of the center of the city into more natural areas. So there's almost sort of green corridors that are connecting the urban parts of Helsinki to the more natural areas. And this is why I wanted to know if birds in Helsinki can eat and disperse the seeds of introduced species from the city into the more natural areas. For this, I had 15 transects across Helsinki, and they were in urban areas, but sort of two different habitats. So first, I had streetscapes that were more natural. So these consisted of avenues, neighborhoods, people's backyards, and things where there was more built up area. And then to simulate more natural environments, I had forest fragments, so which are remnants of the forests around the city, but now they're maintained more for recreational purposes, but they're maintained as forests rather than parks. So in these transects, I observed what was happening on the transect for 30 minutes, how many birds were there, what species were they of, did they eat fruits, how many fruits did they eat? And then once I had made these observations, I also estimated the number of fruits on all the plants on this transect. I did this for 4 months in the autumn for 3 years. And while it's interesting to understand what fruits birds are eating, For dispersal, it's more important to know what seeds are being dispersed by the birds. So we collected fecal samples from blackbirds because blackbirds are the most common frugivorous species in the region. And then from this, we found, almost unsurprisingly, I guess, that there are more introduced plant species in the streetscape habitats that are more built up and more urban rather than the forest fragments. But another surprising result was that there were more birds also in these streetscape habitats as compared to the forest fragments. And then when we looked at the availability of fruit throughout the autumn season across the 3 years, there was always more native fruit available than introduced fruit in both the streetscape and forest fragment habitats. But when we finally looked at what the birds themselves were eating, we found no difference. So birds seem to eat equal amounts of native fruit and introduced fruit. And then this was also reflected in what seeds were being dispersed by the blackbirds. So there was no difference in the number or the proportions of native and introduced species that were being dispersed. So what do all these results mean? Well, firstly, they're showing us that birds are consuming fruit opportunistically, which is not surprising because this research was done during the time of the autumn migration. So all the birds need to bulk up on energy to make their migratory journey. It so happens that in Helsinki right now, there are more native fruit available because of some of the planting decisions that are made by the city. So birds are then opportunistically eating this massive resource, and this is acting possibly as a buffer against them needing to depend on the fruit of the introduced species. But that being said, we found 6 species of introduced plants in the more natural forest fragment habitats. So they're unlikely to be planted there, and this indicates that it's possible that they have spread there via seed dispersal by birds or mammals. And then it's important to study these plants and their invasion potential so that we are not planting plants that are going to become invasive in the future. This is especially true since with climate change, autumns are becoming warmer, winters are becoming warmer. The migration phenology of birds is extending. So now there is a situation more so than a couple of decades before, where these plants that are in the urban areas have more conducive environments now also in the more natural areas, and they could spread further. This research was also recently published in Global Change Biology, and it is freely available to read if you want to see more details regarding this. But my final takeaways from these 2 questions that I had asked during my PhD would be that introduced species do seem to be an important resource in 2 very different cities across the world. So there is in popular culture, there is sort of this talk of if it's not native, then it's not useful in the ecosystem. Nobody's going to use it. It's not helpful to animals. That doesn't seem to be the case from both of my explorations. But it's true that case by case studies are important. So we saw in Bangalore that native birds are probably not contributing to the introduced trees spreading further. However, in Helsinki, that's not the case. The native birds could be contributing. So understanding what's happening in these particular interactions in every city would help us then inform better how to engage with urban greening or planning policy and what is to be planted in the cities in the future. But I'll stop with that now. Hopefully there's enough topics for discussion. But before that, I'd like to thank all my collaborators, so my PhD supervisors, Rose and Alexi, and then also my funders. And thank you all for listening. Now I can take questions.
Thanks, Purbi, for the very nice way in which you compared these 2 very different cities in terms of their plants and birds and interactions. So I'm sure since we have a lot of time left, we can have a good discussion on these. So I think there are some questions. So, so basically, the slide about the interactions and relationship between birds and trees from your Bangalore study, it was quite complex. So the question is, how do you study this and draw the links? So I think if you could explain the diagram and that part once again, I think this.
Just hang on while I go back. So as I was saying, each of the line is an observation of the bird interacting with that plant. And that's how the network diagram is made. I'm not sure, like, I don't know how much more to elaborate on this question exactly.
Okay, so I think what could be helpful is basically the color coding. So the on the left
Okay,
side, the
okay.
blue ones are the native ones, right?
The blue
The
ones are
trees,
the native ones, and the red ones are the introduced ones. Yes.
introduced ones. And
Yes.
on the right side, you have the
So
green.
on the right,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, no, no. Go ahead, go ahead.
On the right side, the birds which are in green were the ones that were seen to interact with the flowers of these trees. And all the other birds, even though some of them are repeated, were just interacting with the tree in any sort of other way. Like, for
Hmm.
example, crows were picking up food from the ground and then sitting on the tree to eat. So it's not necessary that the origin of the tree would impact this sort of interaction, but you never know. Maybe there is something about the structure of the branches and things like that.
Hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, and basically each of the line connecting the tree with the bird is one interaction. So
Yes.
a
So if the
thicker
line is
line
thick,
would
then
in
it's
yeah,
more number of interactions,
more
and the
number
thinner
of
lines.
interactions.
Yes, yes, yes.
And more number of interactions are basically when when you were doing your focal observations, you
Yes,
saw that bird much more many more times on that same
yes, yes,
species than the
yes,
other, right?
yes,
So
exactly.
I
Yes,
yeah, so I hope that this clarifies the doubt of how this sort of graph, what goes into making this sort of uh,
yes.
graph. So yeah, there is another question on I mean, is there an impact of migration patterns of birds on uh, the opportunistic feed patterns of native birds?
Yes, so
Yeah.
I didn't explore this with the Bangalore data, but
Mhm.
we looked at it with the Helsinki data,
Mm.
and we found that partial migrants are driving the trends. So the categories that we had were residents, partial migrants, and migrants. And partial migrants were seen to eat more fruit more later in the season, which is concerning, interesting. You can view it either ways because as the autumns get warmer, there are going to be more partial migrants staying back because they don't need to start their migration that early. And then they're going to eat more of the fruit that's there, and more of the fruit that's available later in the season tends to be the introduced fruit because all of the native fruit are already eaten by then. So yeah, there is
Right.
definitely, there seems to be an effect of the migration pattern for sure.
Yeah, and just adding to that, so I was curious because it's a very nice pattern that you see, very stark difference between what you see in Bangalore versus Helsinki. Uh, but what I was wondering was, would the basic diversity of resource matter in this case? Because, for example, Bangalore being more tropical as compared to Helsinki would tend to have much higher number of species which are rich in nectar, fruiting, and all that thing. So just availability of a diverse resource which is native, of which I mean, would that sort of also play a role in this? I mean, your opinion.
Yeah, yeah. I think certainly it would play a role because the birds seem to be feeding opportunistically. I don't think it
Hmm.
matters. So we could like affect it if we wanted to. But then that sort of brings out the question that how many of like if we wanted to plant only native plants in the city, for example, because that would be good, and then we don't have this potential of invasion and stuff. How many of these native plants are able to handle the urban pressures?
Right.
So if they're not then able to survive well in these urban areas, then isn't it better to just provide some resource to the urban fauna? So it's a little bit complicated in that, and I'd really like to study it further. But yeah,
Yeah.
having more native plants would definitely affect these interactions.
Right. And also the point about sort of intermittent migrants or this thing
Mm-hmm.
which you were
Mm-hmm.
saying. So basically, if we have to take a example of say India, where you do have
Mm-hmm.
local migration also happening,
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
from the northern part to southern and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it would also be interesting to study how a community of birds in a city like Bangalore, if we divide
Yeah,
these birds into the migrants versus sort of
yes,
residents,
yes.
do you also find any difference in how they interact, or is it still
I haven't looked at it. It would
okay?
definitely be interesting to look at. But just thinking back on the migratory species that I was seeing while doing the work, I think the most stark or like the most obvious ones was starlings, so rosy starlings,
Starlings, yeah,
Brahmini starlings,
yeah.
and they seem to prefer the silk cotton, the
Hmm.
like the red silk cotton. So I didn't see them interacting too much with the introduced species, but yeah, of course, because
Mhm.
maybe the resident birds are so exposed to the introduced species that they have over time adapted to using them, and the migratory
Yeah,
species don't spend as much time. So they, but this is of course all speculation. I have I have not looked into it. It'd be
yeah,
interesting to,
yeah.
yeah,
But I think that could be a good way or
yeah,
like good thing to sort of
yeah.
look at. Yeah. So there's one more question on, yeah. So why in Bangalore native birds didn't accept the introduced species and in other case they accepted? So accepted in terms of more frugivory or interactions with that.
So I'm not sure I understand because in Bangalore, the native birds were doing what they're supposed to do with the native trees. So they were pollinating the native trees as would be expected by evolutionary history. And they were still interacting with the introduced plants. So they were still able to use the food from the introduced plants. They were just not providing the service of pollination. But maybe the person who asked this question meant squirrels. And that's interesting to think about because many of the species that were in the paper that I have presented now are from places where there are um, mammalian pollinators. So maybe the squirrels were using the traits that the trees have developed with the evolution for these mammalian pollinators to then themselves pollinate the trees. And maybe the native trees are more evolved, co-evolved with avian or insect pollinators, so they didn't have these traits. So then the squirrels were just eating the entire flower rather than taking nectar.
Yeah. Also, did you find a lot of interactions with bats in
I
Bangalore
didn't
study? Oh,
I didn't study bats, so it was difficult for me to do both morning
right.
observations and night observations.
Yeah.
So no, it'd be great if somebody could do this with bats. I would be very interested to know what's happening. But the plants that I chose then because of that were all have traits that are more for avian pollinators, so
Hmm.
more red color, tubular flowers, and so on.
Right. Okay. So again, there is a question about that network diagram. So do the lines connecting birds and trees in the diagram? So the thickness of these lines, does it change over time due to different changes?
That would be really interesting to know. So, unfortunately, as this was part of my PhD, I had planned 2 years of fieldwork to do this, but then I started fieldwork in 2019 and then COVID happened. So, I was only able to collect data for 1 year. But it'd be really interesting to know
Hmm.
how things are changing because, of course, these trees themselves are, because of whatever various reasons, urban pressures or climate change, are shifting their phenology. We already know that. So, and then some of the birds have breeding seasons during this time, and then they need different food resources during. So it'd be really interesting to study if there's a mismatch, if things are adapting in a similar way, in a similar direction, and so on.
Yeah, and it is also likely that in addition to phenology, the community of birds themselves can change, right? Because there would be
Yes,
some bird species coming in and moving
yes,
out around and so that could
certainly.
definitely lead to
Yep.
certain changes, but basically you will have to do that study to see what you find.
Yeah, yeah. But now that you've mentioned community, I didn't mention that result here.
Hmm.
So I did some species composition analysis to see if the way the species are using these trees is different. And the community of birds that are using taller introduced trees encompasses the community of birds that are using short and tall native trees and short introduced trees. So the most diverse community of birds seems to be the one that is using taller introduced trees.
That
I
is
don't know
quite
what to think of that, but
interesting.
this is just, yeah, this
Yeah,
is something that we found, yeah.
yeah. And again, so basically thinking about the sort of main theme, that is introduced versus native. So how does one actually know that a species is introduced or native? Like,
Well,
how, if anyone wants to find out, how does one go about it?
so for this work, for the work in Bangalore, I used this invasive species compendium by this
Hmm.
organization called CABI. So
Okay.
they're doing research and they're classifying species as where they're from and where they've been introduced to, and they maintain this resource. But then it varies according to where you are. For example, the Australian species, it's very clear they consider when the Brits came there and everything that
Right.
happened from that as introduced. If we are living in like continental Asia and continental Europe, it's more difficult because species can be changing their location by themselves. They could be propagating
Hmm.
into new areas and so on. So this is why I was mentioning that for my work, I've considered either these species that have been known to be introduced and recorded in these databases as introduced, or
Hmm.
even in the case of Helsinki, when there were a lot of cultivars of rose, for example, that are planted
Hmm.
that would not be here by themselves, that have been
Right.
bred to be what they are. And because of that,
Hmm.
then they have different size of fruits, colors of fruits, whatever that might affect frugivores. So then I've considered some of those cultivars also as introduced.
Thanks. So, just adding one to the discussion, that basically you have certain species of trees which are non-native to, say, Helsinki, and you see that they are being sort of, some of them might be being spread by birds to other undisturbed areas in the surrounding. So is there any work which maybe you have done or some other study which sort of explores the traits of these tree species themselves? Are these traits also being changed in the introduced sort of region to basically
Mhm.
aid their spread more? So I mean, that's what a species might sort of, it might be beneficial for it. So
Yeah, no, certainly there's a lot of research going on what makes a plant an invasive species. And as far as I have read the literature, there is no clear answer, but for the temperate regions or boreal regions, if you want to consider Finland, it seems that the leaf surface area is a good predictor of whether the species can proliferate more. But yeah, I mean, the research is still ongoing on this, and it's quite a hotly debated topic.
okay, but basically nothing concrete about the characteristic of the fruit as such, like maybe size or
No,
something.
it does not seem to be, as per my knowledge, at least. But then again, when people are studying this, they tend to focus on the traits of just the plants rather than considering the interaction as a trait itself. And yeah, more research needs to be done
Yeah,
on
because
that.
I think now a lot of focus in community ecology is also explicitly considering interactions,
Yes,
because which
yes,
was
yes,
just left as the uncontrolled variation in your data.
yes,
Now when people have started looking at it, a lot of interesting patterns have started coming out.
yes,
So in that
yes,
context, I think it will be interesting, because I think I read somewhere long back that certain traits of fruits can change depending on the environment and so on. So maybe interactions can also have, like for example,
yes,
the size, the ratio of the seed size to the fleshy part sometime,
yes,
to
yes,
make it say
certainly.
more
Yeah,
attractive
yeah,
to a bird.
yeah.
So
Or if the
or
disperser
the
is
color,
smaller than the
something.
one that you have evolved with, or like, yeah,
Correct,
then the
correct.
traits will certainly, yeah.
So I think, yeah. So I guess like studying those traits in plants, like native versus invasive or introduced, and
Yes,
the characteristic of birds would also be an interesting way. So
yes.
there is another question. When we look at plant species, was this study on the shrub categories as well? So I believe this was, I don't know which study this was referring to, this question, but can you just,
No, but I can clarify, no worries.
yeah,
So in Bangalore, I selected large tree species on purpose because there is a history of planting trees in Bangalore, and then the trees are from different origin. But in Helsinki, yes, then I was also looking at shrubs, creepers, anything that was on the transect that was producing fleshy fruits. I studied all of them, or all of them were included in the data.
Wow, thanks. So, one more interesting aspect of this is the interaction of these species with the humans, right? So we are studying the animal community, part of the animal community, and so on. But then there are also species, I mean, most all these species have been introduced by humans at some point, like most of them at least. And interactions of humans with them have also changed a lot. Like, for example, most of the vegetables that we consume like daily in almost all our meals in India are not native to India.
Yes.
So something like that. So basically, how I mean, like there was also talk that one of the like one sort of entrepreneur had this idea that he liked a particular species of tree and he just wanted to plant like say 10,000 or 10 lakh of those trees in a given city at some point just so that it looks pretty. So I guess the human angle to this is also going to be very important to think about, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you bring in people who are working with landscape design and so on. So
Yes.
aesthetics is one thing which usually is the focus there, but
Yes.
introducing these interactions, I mean, it can potentially lead to a much meaningful design of a landscape, right? So, what do you think?
Certainly, certainly. I know, like, this is why it's interesting to study all of this in urban areas because we can affect so much change because the urban areas are being designed for us, like one species. So, no, it's really interesting. And I've had the opportunity to talk to some architects and urban planners, and this is a topic that's constantly on their mind. So, if we can, from an ecological perspective, also give some information to affect these decisions, I think that would be really useful to maintain biodiversities because in the end I think like nobody wants a drab gray city. Everybody wants to see birds, everybody's happy when you see a squirrel in the park and stuff. So yeah, it's I think like this work can definitely contribute to that line of thinking.
Yeah, and also I think it ties very closely to the issue of biotic homogenization, which you mentioned. So basically, biotic homogenization will tend to increase if a same set
Yes,
design for gardens is applied
yes,
across the world,
yes,
right?
yeah, yeah,
And sort of getting knowledge from that particular study, like you mentioned, it should be a
yeah,
case by case sort of approach,
yeah,
which we need to think about. So I
yeah,
guess that could be a very important takeaway,
yeah,
which we probably overlook very often, but is
yeah.
extremely important when you consider it. So because
Yeah,
there
and
was,
just another thing that I thought of, apart from aesthetics for a city, something that's very important is functionality. You don't want to plant a really pretty tree that has roots that are going to come up on the road and then, or like that has really heavy fruits that fall on the cars that are parked below the tree. So, yeah, that's another like those interactions from the human perspective might also be very important.
there have been cases where people have sort of consulted ecologists to suggest, say, a planting palette to a particular area, and then later gone complaining back to the person saying that, oh, you told us to plant so many whatever creepers
Yeah,
and shrubs and everything, but there is some insect which came and the larvae have destroyed that whole thing. So
yeah,
people
yeah,
sort of don't uh, explicitly consider the interactions of each species of
yeah,
plant with
yeah.
so many different animals which
Yeah,
can be happening.
but
So I
exactly,
guess,
because
yeah.
it's so difficult because if you can think about like I come from a perspective of thinking about birds because that's the taxa that I am interested in. But then you need to get so many experts together to like know all the different taxa, then maybe some functional things, city planners. So yeah, it's a really complex question to know like what to plant, and I never have the answer for that when people ask me.
Yeah, because I think a lot of focus is also been on developing butterfly gardens specifically, and a lot of butterflies are also using non-native varieties for
Yes,
nectar.
yes,
So that is also where where the whole idea of considering interactions is extremely important. And
yes.
thank you so much for sharing all your insights on this topic
No,
and
thank you.
answering so many questions as well. So if there are any other questions, please, the audience can write them. So in the meantime, Pradeep, can you please introduce the sort of initiative between BSF and the library team? Yeah.
Thank you, Purabi and Mihir, for this wonderful talk. Hi, everyone. I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce this exhibition. And for those of you who are here for the first time, I hope I'm audible. Um, IHS is a national education research and capacity development institution for sustainable, efficient transformation of Indian settlements. We are based in Bangalore and we offer a 9-month program at the Bangalore City campus here. And the IHS library, which co-anchors this exhibition and the webinar series that we are currently part of, is established in 2012. And since 2014, we have been open to the public. The library holds more than 42,000 books, maps, films, data, and it's a public reference library. Walk-ins are allowed. And I'm going to post the details about the exhibition, the upcoming webinars here. This exhibition is curated with the Bangalore Sustainability Forum. Uh, BSF is based in Bangalore in National Center for Biological Sciences campus, and it's an interinstitutional initiative that fosters conversations and collaboration towards Bangalore's sustainable future. Some of the themes of work that BSF focuses on air quality to urban water, biodiversity, climate change planning, and so on. Thank you guys for being here, and and for the other upcoming events, I'm going to post details here. Please do register and please come for the exhibition. It's open to the public. Thanks, Meher.
Thank you, Pradeep. So yeah, there's another question. Oh, okay, you have answered it. Yeah. So it's basically talking about how at an individual level we can contribute through home-based gardens and so on. So
Yeah, so I was just thinking about it that it would depend on like what species you want to attract, what do you want butterflies, do you want birds, but maybe the way to not go wrong is to ensure that there is more biodiversity, so many different types of plants, many different types of fruit producing plants, flowers, different shapes, sizes. That might be the best way to go forward.
yeah. So I think we have no more questions. And okay, so thank you so much, Purvi, for taking the time and sharing the details of your research. And I'm sure all of us have really enjoyed your talk. Also, thank you to all the participants and thanks to BSF and Pradeep for putting this, and also to Abhishek for helping us manage this session from NCBS. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much for having me.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.